Hey guys, tonight we are going to climb a mountain. Not with ropes and ice picks, but with our minds. We're going to travel to a place so high up, the air is thin and sharp, and the sky feels impossibly close. A place known as the roof of Africa. Imagine you are standing on the edge of a vast, flat-topped mountain, an amba in the Ethiopian highlands. The sun is intense, but the air is cool. A strange combination you only find at this altitude. Below you, the world falls away into a dizzying network of canyons and ravines, a landscape carved by time and water into a formidable natural fortress. The silence is immense, broken only by the wind whistling through tough, wiry grasses and the distant cry of a soaring lammergeier, a bearded vulture, its wings spanning nearly 10 feet. This is the Ethiopia of the late 19th century. It is not the Africa of sprawling savannas and dense jungles you might picture from old adventure movies. This is a rugged, vertical world. A world of stone and sky, of ancient faith and fierce independence. It is a Christian kingdom, older than many in Europe, with its own unique script, its own calendar, and a lineage of emperors said to stretch back to the time of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And at this moment in history, it is almost entirely alone. All around it, the great powers of Europe are carving up the African continent like a cake, drawing straight lines on maps in faraway Berlin, lines that ignore ancient tribes and natural borders. This is the era of the scramble for Africa, a period of unprecedented colonial conquest. From all sides, the shadows are lengthening. The British are in Egypt and the Sudan. The French are in Djibouti, and the newly unified nation of Italy, hungry for its own place in the sun, has its eyes fixed firmly on the ancient empire of Ethiopia. Tonight's story is about the woman who would stand at the center of this storm. A queen who, with her husband, the emperor, would face down a modern European army and do the unthinkable win. This is the story of Empress Taytu Betul, the light of Ethiopia. A brilliant strategist, a ruthless politician, and a woman who refused to bow to an empire. But before we meet her, a quick reality check. As amazing as this world is to visit in our imaginations, you probably wouldn't survive it. The first thing to get you wouldn't be a wild animal or a warrior's spear. It would be the altitude. Arriving from your comfortable sea-level home, your lungs, accustomed to thick, oxygen-rich air, would feel like two wet sponges. You would spend your first week with a pounding headache, gasping for breath while trying to climb a simple flight of stairs. You would be dizzy, nauseous, and completely exhausted, all while trying to look dignified in front of local Ethiopians who bound up the mountain paths like goats, wondering why you seem to be melting. It is a tough look to pull off. But you are safe, of course, floating weightlessly through time. Your lungs breathing the comfortable air of your own room. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Every click helps this little channel continue its quiet journey through the forgotten corners of history. And please, feel free to post your location and local time in the comments below. It's always a joy to see where everyone is tuning in from, a global community settling down for the night. It's just after 11:50 p.m. here in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and the night is warm and still. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in an era of profound arrogance. The late 19th century was the high-water mark of European imperialism. Fueled by the Industrial Revolution and a firm, often racist, belief in their own cultural and technological superiority. At the Berlin Conference of 1884–85, representatives of 13 European powers, plus the United States, gathered to put a veneer of legality on their colonial ambitions in Africa. They drew up rules for how to claim territory, essentially agreeing that if you could plant a flag and establish effective occupation, often through coerced treaties or military force, peace of Africa was yours. No African leaders were invited. It was the ultimate expression of the colonial mindset that Africa was a blank slate, an empty map waiting to be filled in by them. But Ethiopia was not a blank slate. It was an ancient and complex civilization, a tapestry woven from threads of history stretching back thousands of years. It was the site of the powerful Aksumite Empire, which in its heyday was considered one of the four great powers of the ancient world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. It was one of the first nations on earth to officially adopt Christianity as its state religion, way back in the 4th century. Its church developed its own unique traditions and theology, led by its own patriarch, and conducted its services in the ancient liturgical language of Ge'ez. This deep sense of unique identity was a powerful defense. The Ethiopians didn't see themselves as just one of many tribes on a continent ripe for conquest. They saw themselves as the inhabitants of a divinely protected kingdom, a Christian island in a sea of encroaching powers. Their emperors, who held the title Enkusku, Engus, or King of Kings, claimed their authority through an unbroken line from the biblical King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, according to the nation's epic foundational text. The Kebra Nagast, the Queen of Sheba, traveled to Jerusalem, had a son with Solomon named Menelik. And this son returned to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant itself, which, according to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, still rests in a chapel in the city of Aksum to this day. This deep-rooted history gave the Ethiopian people a powerful sense of self and a fierce will to remain independent. They even operated on their own time. Literally, the Ethiopian calendar, derived from the older Coptic calendar, has 12 months of 30 days each, followed by a 13th mini-month of 5 or 6 days, called Pagum. Because of this, and other differences in calculating the birth of Christ, the Ethiopian calendar is about 7 years and 8 months behind the Gregorian calendar we use. So, while our story is happening in the 1880s and 90s for the people living it, it was the 1870s and 80s. They were, in a very real sense, living in their own distinct timeline. This formidable culture was housed in a formidable landscape. The Ethiopian highlands are a vast complex of mountains and plateaus, slashed by deep river gorges. This terrain made movement incredibly difficult for any invading army, especially one burdened by heavy artillery and long supply lines. The country was a natural castle, and its people knew how to defend it. For centuries, they had fought off invaders from the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate to Egyptian forces in the 1870s. They were not unaccustomed to war. Historians still argue whether Ethiopia's successful resistance against the scramble for Africa was primarily due to its difficult, mountainous terrain, which favored defenders, the savvy diplomacy and modernization efforts of its rulers, or the sheer military strength and national unity it could muster at critical moments. In truth, it was a combination of all three, and at the center of that combination of diplomacy, military prowess, and fierce unity, you will find our queen, Taytu Betul. She was born into this world of high mountains and deep history, a world that was proud, ancient, and increasingly threatened. The story of how she helped harness her nation's strengths to outwit, outfight, and outlast a modern European empire is one of the great epics of world history. But she didn't appear out of nowhere. She was the product of a long line of powerful players in the complex, often bloody, game of Ethiopian politics. To understand the Empress, you must first understand the woman. And our journey into her life begins not in the imperial palace, but in the northern heartlands of the empire, where her story and her ambition first took root. To understand the Empress, you must first understand the woman. And our journey into her life begins not in the imperial palace, but in the northern heartlands of the empire, where her story and her ambition first took root, your mind drifts north to the jagged peaks and high plateaus of the Semien and Begemder provinces. This is the historic center of the old Ethiopian Empire, a land of ancient monasteries, powerful warlords, and labyrinthine politics. It is here, around the year 1851, that a girl named Taytu Betul was born into a world of immense power and privilege. Her family tree wasn't just a tree. It was a dense forest of influential nobles, governors, and would-be emperors. She wasn't just well-connected. She was descended from the very families that had dominated Ethiopian politics for over a century during a chaotic period known as the Zamin Masafint, or the era of the princes. This was a time when the central authority of the emperor had weakened, and regional lords ruled their territories like independent kings. Her uncle, Digismak Wub Hail Mariam, had been one of the most powerful of these rulers, controlling much of northern Ethiopia and coming very close to seizing imperial throne for himself. Power was in Taytu's blood. She grew up breathing the thin air of political strategy and ambition. From a young age, she received an education that was exceptional for any woman of her time, but not unheard of for a daughter of the highest nobility. She was not just literate in her native Amharic. She was also schooled in the ancient and complex liturgical language of Ge'ez. This gave her direct access to the holy scriptures of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, as well as the historical chronicles of the emperors, the Kebra Nagast, and the rich tradition of Ethiopian poetry. This literary and religious grounding gave her a deep understanding of her nation's history and a profound piety that would guide her throughout her life. But her intelligence wasn't purely academic. It was sharp, strategic, and practical. She was known to be a master of two particularly revealing pastimes. The first was keen, a highly sophisticated form of Amharic poetry where every line has two distinct meanings. A surface meaning, the wax, and a deeper, hidden meaning, the gold. To compose, or even just to understand, keen requires a mind that can operate on multiple levels at once. A mind that appreciates subtlety, illusion, and hidden messages. It was the perfect training for a diplomat and a politician. Her second pastime was centurage, or Ethiopian chess. The game is a cousin to the chess you may know, but with its own unique rules and character. For instance, in the opening phase, called the Warera, players move their pieces as fast as they can, all at the same time, to occupy strategic squares before the battle is truly joined. It's a game that rewards foresight, rapid calculation, and a deep understanding of strategic positioning. Taytu was said to play with a keen and ruthless intelligence. while others around her may have been thinking 1 or 2 moves ahead. She was a woman who saw the entire board, who understood the deep strategy behind the opening gambits. She was playing 4D chess, while many of her rivals were still playing checkers. As a high-born woman from a powerful family, her life was mapped out through a series of strategic marriages. Historians still argue about the exact number of Taytu's previous husbands, with records suggesting anywhere from 3 to as many as 5 before she met Menelik. In the context of the 19th century European court, this might sound scandalous. But in the world of the Ethiopian nobility, it was simply smart politics. Marriage and divorce were common, carrying little of the religious or social stigma they did elsewhere. A marriage was an alliance, a contract between 2 powerful families. Her early marital history reads less like a romance novel and more like a series of corporate mergers. Each husband was a political calculation, a way to build alliances and consolidate power within the complex web of northern politics. When an alliance no longer served its purpose, the merger could be dissolved, and she would be free to forge a new, more advantageous one. This was not the life of a passive pawn being moved around the board. This was the life of an active player, using the institutions available to her to strengthen her own position and that of her family. Through these experiences, she developed a formidable personality. Accounts from those who knew her describe a woman who was intensely proud, keenly intelligent, and fiercely pious. She was also famously, and perhaps wisely, deeply suspicious of foreigners, the Ferenczak. She had seen and heard enough of European encroachment in Africa to not trust their motives for a single second. While some in the Ethiopian court were charmed by European visitors, flattered by their gifts and their talk of modernity, Taytu was not. She possessed a hard-headed realism, a kind of political armor that could not be penetrated by flattery or false promises. This unwavering suspicion of European intentions would prove to be one of her and her nation's greatest assets. So, this is the woman we find in the early 1880s. She is in her early 30s, a mature and experienced political operator. She is a literary mind, a chess master, a shrewd negotiator who has managed her own path through the thorny landscape of aristocratic marriage. She possesses an impeccable lineage, a sharp and unforgiving intellect, and a deep love for her country and her faith. She has her own wealth, her own lands, and her own network of loyal family and followers. She is a force to be reckoned with all on her own. And now, this formidable woman from the northern heartlands is about to meet her match. A man whose ambition is as great as her own. A man who is methodically consolidating his power in the south. The king of Shua, Sahal, Mariam, who you and I know by his future imperial name, And now, this formidable woman from the northern heartlands is about to meet her match, a man whose ambition is as great as her own. A man who is methodically consolidating his power in the south, the king of Shua, Saha Mariam, who you and I know by his future imperial name, Menelik. To understand why their union was so momentous, you must first understand Menelik. If Taytu was the polished, strategic queen of northern politics, Menelik was a survivor, a pragmatist, and a patient empire builder from the south. He was the king of Shua, a province that had grown powerful and semi-independent. Crucially, he too claimed direct descent from the Solomonic line, giving him a legitimate, if contested, claim to the imperial throne. As a young man, he had been a political prisoner of the reigning emperor. Tewodros too, held captive for 10 years in the mountain fortress of Magdala. But Menelik was not one to languish. He used his captivity to observe, to learn, and to make allies. And in 1865, he pulled off a daring escape, returning to Shua to reclaim his throne and begin his slow, methodical consolidation of power. He was a technology enthusiast, fascinated by the modern weapons and gadgets of the Europeans, and one of the first Ethiopian rulers to see the necessity of modernization for survival. So you have this emperor in waiting who traces his lineage to the Bible, but who also absolutely had to have the 19th century equivalent of the first iPhone. He was a complex man for a complex time. By the early 1880s, the political map of Ethiopia was dominated by two great powers. In the north, the Emperor of Ethiopia, Johannes IV, a stern and formidable Tigrayan warrior king, and in the south, his most powerful vassal and greatest rival, King Menelik of Shua. The two men circled each other in a tense political dance. Menelik had expanded his influence south and east, but to truly make a bid for the imperial crown, he needed to secure his footing in the old political heartlands of the north. He needed allies, he needed legitimacy, he needed Taytu Betul. The marriage, which took place in 1883, was a masterstroke of political strategy. It was the 19th century Ethiopian equivalent of a blockbuster TV drama. The season finale, where the two most powerful houses finally form an alliance, setting the stage for the final showdown. By marrying Taytu, Menelik instantly gained a powerful link to her family's vast network of allies and loyalists across the northern provinces. It was a perfectly executed political maneuver, uniting the rising power of the south with the established nobility of the north. It sent a clear message to the reigning emperor and to the rest of the country. A new, unified power bloc had just been formed. But what began as a marriage of pure political convenience blossomed into one of history's great partnerships. Menelik quickly recognized that his new wife was not just a symbol of northern acceptance. She was a brilliant political mind in her own right. He came to rely on her counsel deeply. While Menelik could be pragmatic, patient, and sometimes willing to compromise, Taytu was often the hardliner. She was more suspicious, more confrontational, and possessed what seemed to be a flawless instinct for sniffing out deception, particularly from the Europeans who were beginning to swarm the court. They were the ultimate power couple. He was the visionary CU, focused on long-term expansion and modernization. She was the formidable coup and head of security, managing internal politics, vetting all new partnerships, and possessing an uncanny ability to spot a bad deal a mile away. You would not want to be on the other side of a negotiating table from the two of them. Historians debate the extent to which Taytu influenced Menelik's early policies versus how much she grew into her advisory role over time. Was she the driving force behind his imperial ambitions from day one, or did her influence become more pronounced later as the threat from Italy grew more acute? What is clear is that she was never a passive queen consort, content to remain in the background. She took an active role in the governance of the kingdom, attending council meetings with Menelik's top generals and advisors. She would sit, listen intently, and when she spoke, it was with authority and intelligence. Menelik not only allowed this, he encouraged it, frequently valuing her perspective above all others. She maintained her own lands and fortune, and used them to build her own network of loyal followers, giving her an independent power base that even the king had to respect. You can picture them in their palace, a sprawling compound of circular, thatch-roofed buildings. They would spend hours discussing the complex political landscape, analyzing the motives of a rival lord, or dissecting a letter from a European envoy. Taytu, with her deep knowledge of history and her sharp, multi-layered wax and gold intellect, would point out the hidden meanings, the subtle threats, the unspoken assumptions. Menelik, the pragmatist, would weigh the strategic options, calculating the risks and rewards. Together, they forged a unified policy, their two minds working as one. Their partnership was the bedrock upon which modern Ethiopia would be built. But for that to happen, they first had to ascend to the imperial throne. For years, they waited, consolidating their power, building their armies, and watching the emperor. Johannes, their moment arrived with shocking suddenness. In March of 1889, Emperor Johannes IV was killed in battle, fighting not the Italians, but an invading army of modest Sudanese forces at the Battle of Galabat. The emperor's death created a power vacuum. With his main rival gone, Menelik moved swiftly. Backed by his powerful Shuhan army and the vast network of northern nobility, secured by his marriage to Tatu, he marched north and had himself crowned Enkosku Engest, King of Kings, Emperor of Ethiopia. Taytu Betul, the girl from the Semian Mountains, the shrewd political operator, the chess master, was now the empress. But they had little time to celebrate. As they took the throne, the shadow of Europe was lengthening into a dark, ominous storm, and a newly unified Italy, desperate for a colonial empire to call its own, was about to make its move. The new emperor and empress were about to face the greatest test of their lives and of their nation's long history. But they had little time to celebrate. As they took the throne, the shadow of Europe was lengthening into a dark, ominous storm, and a newly unified Italy, desperate for a colonial empire to call its own, was about to make its move. The new emperor and empress were about to face the greatest test of their lives and of their nation's long history. To understand this storm, you have to pull your focus away from the highlands of Ethiopia for a moment and look at the world from a different perspective, from the capitals of Europe. You are in the drawing rooms and foreign ministries of London, Paris, and Rome. The air is thick with cigar smoke, ambition, and a supreme, unshakable sense of self-confidence. This is the engine room of the scramble for Africa. The motivations are a tangled web of greed, piety, and prestige. There is the economic driver. The factories of industrial Europe are hungry for raw materials, rubber, cotton, tin, palm oil. They need new markets to sell their finished goods. There is the so-called civilizing mission, a wonderfully self-serving piece of marketing that allowed European powers to frame their invasion and exploitation of other nations as a noble, charitable act. It's like a burglar telling you he's only breaking into your house to teach you the benefits of a modern security system. And then there is the most powerful driver of all, simple national pride. In the chest-thumping world of late 19th century European politics, a nation wasn't considered a true great power unless it had a sprawling colonial empire. An empire was the ultimate status symbol, the geopolitical equivalent of a massive yacht. And so, they carved up the continent. Britain was drawing a line from the Cape to Cairo. France was dominating the vast expanse of West Africa. King Leopold of Belgium had his personal, brutal fiefdom in the Congo. Germany, another new nation, was snapping up territories wherever it could. And then there was Italy. Italy was the new kid on the block, having only unified as a single country in the 1860s and 70s. It arrived at the great all-you-can-colonize buffet a bit late. The choicest dishes had already been taken by the established powers, and Italy was left with the geopolitical equivalent of the last few dinner rolls and some wilted salad. This created a profound sense of national anxiety, a desperate hunger to prove it belonged at the adults' table. They looked at the map of Africa and saw one of the last remaining independent nations, the ancient, prestigious empire of Ethiopia, and thought, there is our place in the sun. Historians debate the primary driver of Italian colonialism in this period. Was it a genuine economic desire for resources and new markets? Or was it, as much modern scholarship suggests, driven more by these intense psychological needs? Desperate quest for national prestige, the desire to be seen as an equal to Britain and France, and the need for a grand foreign adventure to distract from political turmoil at home. Whatever the root cause, the ambition was fierce. Their plan began not with a bang, but with a purchase. Their foothold in Africa started with a surprisingly mundane corporate real estate deal. In 1869, a private Italian shipping company bought the port of Aseb on the Red Sea coast from a local sultan to use as a simple coaling station for its steamships. For over a decade, it was little more than a glorified maritime gas station. Then, in 1882, the Italian government officially bought the port from the company and began to use it as a base for colonial expansion. From Aseb, they pushed inland, gradually expanding their territory along the coast into what they would formally establish. In 1890, as the colony of Eritrea, its location was no accident. It was the perfect staging ground, a dagger pointed directly at the heart of the Ethiopian highlands from their new coastal colony. The Italians looked up at the mountains of Ethiopia with a toxic mixture of desire and disdain. In their eyes, Ethiopia wasn't a unified nation with thousands of years of history. It was a chaotic collection of warring tribes led by barbaric chieftains. They believed its people were racially inferior and its armies no match for modern European weaponry and discipline. They saw the complex rivalries between Ethiopian lords, like the one between Menelik and the former Emperor Johannes, and believed they could easily play one against the other, using diplomacy and bribes to fracture the empire from within before taking it by force. This profound underestimation, this bedrock of racist hubris, would be one of their most fatal errors. They saw the political divisions, but failed to understand the deep cultural and religious unity that could bind the nation together in a time of crisis. They saw the rugged terrain, but didn't truly comprehend the immense logistical nightmare it would present to a conventional European army. And they saw the new Emperor Menelik as just another regional warlord they could manipulate. They had not yet taken the full measure of the man, and they had certainly not taken the measure of his new empress, the woman who was more immune to their charms and more suspicious of their motives than anyone else in the empire. As Menelik and Taytu celebrated their coronation, they were already in contact with the Italians. Menelik, the pragmatist, was willing to deal with them. He needed guns, he needed money, and he needed European recognition of his new title. The Italians, seeing an opportunity, were more than happy to provide these things, believing it would make Menelik dependent on them and draw him into their sphere of influence. They saw him as a client, a puppet. They were about to learn that Menelik, and especially Taytu, had no intention of being anyone's puppet. The stage was set for a diplomatic confrontation, a battle of wits that would be fought over the single most important and most treacherous document in modern Ethiopian history, the Treaty of Wuchali. The stage was set for a diplomatic confrontation, a battle of wits that would be fought over the single most important and most treacherous document in modern Ethiopian history, the Treaty of Wuchali. Let your mind drift now to the small market town of Wuchali, nestled in the Ethiopian highlands. The year is 1889. It is May, just 2 months after Menelik has been crowned emperor. The air of celebration is still fresh, but it is mixed with a sense of urgency. The new emperor needs to solidify his rule, and a key part of that is gaining recognition from the European powers. And so, here in Wuchali, his envoys sit down across from the Italian representative, a smooth and experienced diplomat named Count Pietro Antonelli. This was not a negotiation between equals, at least not in the minds of the Italians. It was more like a crafty wolf offering a partnership agreement to a lion. The wolf is hoping the lion is too busy with big-picture lion business, like consolidating his kingdom, to read the fine print that says the wolf now gets to decide what's for dinner. From Menelik's perspective, this treaty was a practical necessity. He needed the legitimacy that came with European recognition. He needed a loan to pay his armies and fund his modernization projects. And most importantly, he needed a steady supply of modern European firearms to ensure he could put down any internal rivals and defend his borders. From the Italian perspective, Menelik's needs were a golden opportunity. He lived in Ethiopia for years and cultivated a friendly relationship with Menelik, came to the table offering all of these things. He offered recognition. He offered a loan of 2 million lira. He offered guns. But it all came at a price. In exchange, Menelik was to recognize Italy's claims to its coastal colony of Eritrea, ceding some territory in the northern highlands that had traditionally been part of the Ethiopian Empire. Keita, the pragmatist, agreed to these terms. It was a bitter pill to swallow. But he felt it was a necessary sacrifice for the greater goal of unifying and strengthening his empire. The treaty was drawn up. It contained 20 articles covering everything from trade and territorial boundaries to the extradition of criminals. And it was written, crucially, in 2 languages: Amharic, the official language of the Ethiopian court, and Italian. Both versions were signed, sealed, and declared to be official and identical. And in that small difference between the 2 texts, the poison was hidden. Let's zoom in on one article. Article 17. It seemed innocuous enough, a simple statement about future diplomatic relations. As you read the Amharic version, the one Menelik and his advisors read, it seems perfectly reasonable. It states that His Majesty, the Emperor of Ethiopia, can, if he chooses, use the good offices of the Italian government for any communications he needs to send to other European powers. The key word is can. It presents an option. It's a friendly offer of diplomatic help. Hey, dealing with the British and the French can be a pain. If you ever want us to pass a message along for you, just let us know. We can help. It seems like the kind of thing a helpful new friend would offer. Now, let your mind drift over to the Italian version of that same article, the one Count Antonelli would take back to Rome. Here, the wording is subtly and catastrophically different. It states that His Majesty, the Emperor of Ethiopia, consents to make use of the Italian government for all business he has with the other powers of Europe. The optional can has become a binding consent, too. It's the most consequential typo in African history. The difference between you can use my phone if you want, and you have agreed that I am now your official service provider for all calls, texts, and data forever. One is a generous offer. The other is a hostile takeover. Historians and linguists still debate whether the discrepancy in Article 17 was a deliberate, malicious deception from the very beginning, or a case of what some have called felicitous mistranslation, a convenient ambiguity in the original text that the Italian government chose to interpret in its most aggressive form after the fact. The vast majority of modern scholarship, however, points to the former. The change was too precise, too perfectly aligned with Italy's colonial ambitions to be an accident. It was a trap, carefully laid and written in the ink of diplomatic betrayal. Menelik, believing he had signed a treaty of friendship and secured the tools he needed to build his nation, ratified the agreement. The trap was sprung. Almost immediately, the Italian government sent a circular note to all the other major European powers, citing their version of Article 17. They proudly announced that Ethiopia had, by treaty, accepted the status of an Italian protectorate. All diplomatic business with Ethiopia, they declared, must now be conducted through Rome. From the European perspective, it was a done deal. Italy had, through a clever bit of penmanship, seemingly acquired the crown jewel of East Africa without firing a shot. They had their place in the sun. They had their empire. They ran to the other European powers like a smug kid on the playground, shouting, "Ethiopia is my best friend now, and you can only talk to him through me." All while holding up a permission slip they had sneakily written themselves back in the highlands of Ethiopia. The new emperor was busy consolidating his power, still unaware of the full extent of the deception. The poison of the treaty was already working its way through the veins of European diplomacy. But the news had not yet reached the palace. The Italians believed they had outsmarted the barbaric African king. They had seriously, profoundly underestimated him. And they had completely failed to account for the one person at his side who had a built-in, foolproof detector for exactly this kind of foreign treachery: his wife, the Empress Taytu. The news was coming, and with it, a reckoning. The news was coming, and with it, a reckoning. The reckoning did not take long to arrive, and it came not as a thunderclap, but as a series of confusing whispers. It began with letters. Menelik, as the newly crowned emperor, sent formal announcements of his ascension to the great heads of state in Europe, like Queen Victoria of Great Britain and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. But the replies he received were strange. They didn't come directly back to his court. Instead, they were routed through King Umberto I of Italy. It was like getting mail from your grandmother, but it has been opened and forwarded by that pushy new neighbor who keeps insisting he can manage your affairs better than you can. Puzzled and suspicious, Menelik summoned his own trusted translators, one of whom was a brilliant Swiss engineer in his service named Alfred Ilg. He also consulted with learned Ethiopian nobles who were fluent in European languages. He put the two versions of the Treaty of Wuchali side by side: the Amharic text, the Italian text. And there, under the harsh light of scrutiny, the poison in Article 17 became horrifyingly clear. 2. It was a deliberate, calculated act of diplomatic fraud. The friendship, the loan, the recognition, it had all been a pretext to slip a colonial leash around his nation's neck. Menelik's first reaction was a cold, simmering fury, but it was tempered with the anxiety of a ruler in a precarious position. He had taken the Italian loan. His army was not yet fully equipped with the modern rifles he needed. An open break with Italy could be disastrous. He began a series of letters to Rome, trying to resolve the issue through diplomacy, pointing out the clear discrepancy, hoping it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But Empress Taytu saw no room for misunderstanding. While her husband wrestled with the pragmatic realities, Taytu saw the issue in the stark, clear colors of principle. To her, this was not a political problem to be managed. It was a profound insult to their sovereignty, a threat to their faith, and a stain on their national honor. When she learned the full extent of the deception, she didn't just get angry. She went into full, I need to speak to the manager of this entire colonial enterprise mode. And Count Pietro Antonelli was about to find out that his annual performance review was going to be absolutely brutal. You can picture the scene. Antonelli is summoned to the palace in Addis Ababa. He is ushered into the audience hall, a grand chamber filled with the emperor's top generals and advisors, the Raises and the Jesmaks, stern-faced men in magnificent robes, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. The air is thick with tension. The Emperor Menelik sits on his throne, his expression a mask of regal displeasure. And beside him, her gaze, like chips of obsidian, sits the Empress Taytu. Historians debate how much of Taytu's famous confrontation was spontaneous, righteous anger versus a carefully pre-planned piece of political theater. Was she performing a kind of good cop, bad cop routine with Menelik, allowing her to express the raw outrage that he, as the head of state, needed to temper? Or was this the genuine explosion of a proud, intelligent woman who had been pushed too far? Knowing what we know of her character, it was likely a powerful fusion of both. Antonelli, ever the smooth diplomat, tried to explain away the discrepancy. He argued that the Italian wording was the true meaning of the article, that it was intended to protect Ethiopia. He patronizingly suggested that the Amharic language was perhaps not sophisticated enough to capture the nuances of European diplomatic concepts. This was a profound mistake. He had just insulted the language of the court in front of one of its great literary connoisseurs. Taytu cut him off. She leaned forward, her voice ringing with authority, and began to cross-examine him like a lawyer. She parsed the Amharic, parsed the Italian. She pointed out the unambiguous nature of the Amharic verb, colloquial, he can. It is possible for him, and contrasted it with the binding nature of the Italian text. She picked apart his condescending logic, her words, as one historian put it, like a whip. She cornered him, leaving him no room to maneuver. Finally, abandoning all pretense of diplomacy, she delivered the verbal finishing blow that would echo through Ethiopian history. "I am a woman," she declared to the stunned court. "But I would rather have war than accept a peace that would be shameful for my country." Then she turned her gaze on the treaty itself and declared that she would happily tear it to pieces, that her declaration was the 19th century diplomatic equivalent of flipping the entire negotiating table. It electrified the court. Any wavering nobles who might have counseled caution were silenced. She had articulated the nation's choice with perfect, unshakable clarity: honor over subjugation at any cost. She had drawn a line in the sand and dared the Italians to cross it. In the months that followed, Ethiopia took small but significant steps to signal its defiance. As a gesture of their independence, when the first installment of the Italian loan came due, Menelik and Taytu paid it not in cash, but in bars of pure silver, using old Austrian Maria Theresa thalers that were the common currency of the region. It was a subtle message: we will honor our debts, but on our own terms, with our own money. We are not your client. The treaty was drawn up. It contained 20 articles covering everything from trade and territorial boundaries to the extradition of criminals. And it was written, crucially, in 2 languages: Amharic, the official language of the Ethiopian court, and Italian. Both versions were signed, sealed, and declared to be official and identical. And in that small difference between the 2 texts, the poison was hidden. Let's zoom in on one article. Article 17. It seemed innocuous enough, a simple statement about future diplomatic relations. As you read the Amharic version, the one Menelik and his advisors read, it seems perfectly reasonable. It states that His Majesty, the Emperor of Ethiopia, can, if he chooses, use the good offices of the Italian government for any communications he needs to send to other European powers. The key word is can. It presents an option. It's a friendly offer of diplomatic help. Hey, dealing with the British and the French can be a pain. If you ever want us to pass a message along for you, just let us know. We can help. It seems like the kind of thing a helpful new friend would offer. Now, let your mind drift over to the Italian version of that same article. The one Count Antonelli would take back to Rome. Here, the wording is subtly and catastrophically different. It states that His Majesty, the Emperor of Ethiopia, consents to make use of the Italian government for all business he has with the other powers of Europe. The optional can has become a binding consents to. It's the most consequential typo in African history. The difference between "you can use my phone if you want" and "you have agreed that I am now your official service provider for all calls, texts, and data forever." One is a generous offer. The other is a hostile takeover. Historians and linguists still debate whether the discrepancy in Article 17 was a deliberate, malicious deception from the very beginning, or a case of what some have called felicitous mistranslation. A convenient ambiguity in the original text that the Italian government chose to interpret in its most aggressive form after the fact. The vast majority of modern scholarship, however, points to the former. The change was too precise, too perfectly aligned with Italy's colonial ambitions to be an accident. It was a trap, carefully laid and written in the ink of diplomatic betrayal. Menelik, believing he had signed a treaty of friendship and secured the tools he needed to build his nation, ratified the agreement. The trap was sprung almost immediately. The Italian government sent a circular note to all the other major European powers. Citing their version of Article 17, they proudly announced that Ethiopia had, by treaty, accepted the status of an Italian protectorate. All diplomatic business with Ethiopia, they declared, must now be conducted through Rome. From the European perspective, it was a done deal. Italy had, through a clever bit of penmanship, seemingly acquired the crown jewel of East Africa without firing a shot. They had their place in the sun. They had their empire. They ran to the other European powers like a smug kid on the playground, shouting, "Ethiopia is my best friend now, and you can only talk to him through me," all while holding up a permission slip they had sneakily written themselves. Back in the highlands of Ethiopia, the new emperor was busy consolidating his power, still unaware of the full extent of the deception. The poison of the treaty was already working its way through the veins of European diplomacy, but the news had not yet reached the palace. The Italians believed they had outsmarted the barbaric African king. They had seriously, profoundly underestimated him, and they had completely failed to account for the one person at his side who had a built-in, foolproof detector for exactly this kind of foreign treachery: his wife, the Empress Taytu. The news was coming, and with it, a reckoning. The news was coming, and with it, a reckoning. The reckoning did not take long to arrive, and it came not as a thunderclap, but as a series of confusing whispers. It began with letters. Menelik, as the newly crowned emperor, sent formal announcements of his ascension to the great heads of state in Europe, like Queen Victoria of Great Britain and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. But the replies he received were strange. They didn't come directly back to his court. Instead, they were routed through King Umberto I of Italy. It was like getting mail from your grandmother, but it has been opened and forwarded by that pushy new neighbor who keeps insisting he can manage your affairs better than you can. Puzzled and suspicious, Menelik summoned his own trusted translators, one of whom was a brilliant Swiss engineer in his service named Alfred Ilg. He also consulted with learned Ethiopian nobles who were fluent in European languages. He put the two versions of the Treaty of Wuchali side by side, the Amharic text, the Italian text, and there, under the harsh light of scrutiny, the poison in Article 17 became horrifyingly clear. The optional can versus the binding consents. 2. It was a deliberate, calculated act of diplomatic fraud. The friendship, the loan, the recognition, it had all been a pretext to slip a colonial leash around his nation's neck. Menelik's first reaction was a cold, simmering fury, but it was tempered with the anxiety of a ruler in a precarious position. He had taken the Italian loan. His army was not yet fully equipped with the modern rifles he needed. An open break with Italy could be disastrous. He began a series of letters to Rome, trying to resolve the issue through diplomacy, pointing out the clear discrepancy, hoping it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But Empress Taytu saw no room for misunderstanding. While her husband wrestled with the pragmatic realities, Taytu saw the issue in the stark, clear colors of principle. To her, this was not a political problem to be managed. It was a profound insult to their sovereignty, a threat to their faith, and a stain on their national honor. When she learned the full extent of the deception, she didn't just get angry. She went into full, I need to speak to the manager of this entire colonial enterprise mode. And Count Pietro Antonelli was about to find out that his annual performance review was going to be absolutely brutal. You can picture the scene. Antonelli is summoned to the palace in Addis Ababa. He is ushered into the audience hall, a grand chamber filled with the emperor's top generals and advisors, the Raises and D-Jasmaks, stern-faced men in magnificent robes, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. The air is thick with tension. The Emperor Menelik sits on his throne, his expression a mask of regal displeasure. And beside him, her gaze like chips of obsidian, sits the Empress Taytu. Historians debate how much of Taytu's famous confrontation was spontaneous, righteous anger versus a carefully pre-planned piece of political theater. Was she performing a kind of good cop, bad cop routine with Menelik, allowing her to express the raw outrage that he, as the head of state, needed to temper? Or was this the genuine explosion of a proud, intelligent woman who had been pushed too far, eh? Knowing what we know of her character, it was likely a powerful fusion of both. Antonelli, ever the smooth diplomat, tried to explain away the discrepancy. He argued that the Italian wording was the true meaning of the article, that it was intended to protect Ethiopia. He patronizingly suggested that the Amharic language was perhaps not sophisticated enough to capture the nuances of European diplomatic concepts. This was a profound mistake. He had just insulted the language of the court in front of one of its great literary connoisseurs. Taytu cut him off. She leaned forward, her voice ringing with authority, and began to cross-examine him like a lawyer. She parsed the Amharic, parsed the Italian. She pointed out the unambiguous nature of the Amharic verb jikalakwel, he can. It is possible for him, and contrasted it with the binding nature of the Italian text. She picked apart his condescending logic, her words, as one historian put it, like a whip. She cornered him, leaving him no room to maneuver. Finally, abandoning all pretense of diplomacy, she delivered the verbal finishing blow that would echo through Ethiopian history. "I am a woman," she declared to the stunned court. "I do not like war, but I would rather have war than accept a peace that would be shameful for my country." Then she turned her gaze on the treaty itself and declared that she would happily tear it to pieces. Her declaration was the 19th century diplomatic equivalent of flipping the entire negotiating table. It electrified the court. Any wavering nobles who might have counseled caution were silenced. She had articulated the nation's choice with perfect, unshakable clarity. Honor over subjugation at any cost. She had drawn a line in the sand and dared the Italians to cross it. In the months that followed, Ethiopia took small but significant steps to signal its defiance. As a gesture of their independence, when the first installment of the Italian loan came due, Menelik and Taytu paid it not in cash, but in bars of pure silver, using old Austrian Maria Theresa thalers that were the common currency of the region. It was a subtle message: we will honor our debts, but on our own terms, with our own money. We are not your client. The first major test came on a mountain pass called Emba Alagi here. An isolated Italian column of around 2,500 men, mostly Eritrean colonial troops known as Askaris, led by Italian officers, had dug themselves in. They were commanded by Major Pietro Toselli. They knew a large Ethiopian force was approaching, but they were confident their superior discipline and position could hold off any attack. They were tragically mistaken. The Ethiopian advance guard, commanded by some of Menelik's finest generals, arrived first. They were not a disorganized mob. They were seasoned soldiers. On December 7th, 1895, they launched a coordinated, multi-pronged assault on the Italian positions. The fighting was fierce, lasting for hours. The Italians, though heavily outnumbered, fought bravely, their machine guns inflicting heavy casualties. But the Ethiopians kept coming, using their knowledge of the terrain to outflank the Italian positions. Finally, the Ethiopian commanders threw in their reserves. The line of Askaris, their ammunition running low and their officers falling, finally broke. The battle turned into a rout. The Ethiopians swarmed the Italian positions, and the column was all but annihilated. Major Toselli himself was killed. Of the 2,500 men under his command, only a few hundred managed to escape. It was a stunning, bloody, and unequivocal Ethiopian victory. News of the disaster at Amba Alagi sent a shockwave through the Italian command. This was not the easy colonial war they had been promised, and numerous. The Italians had poked what they thought was a dormant beehive, only to discover it was very, very full and very, very angry. While this first clash was happening in the north, Menelik and Taytu were still with the main imperial army a week's march to the south. You can imagine them in the vast royal encampment at night, the air filled with the smoke of thousands of campfires. Dispatches would arrive daily by horsemen bringing news from the front. Taytu was a central figure in this mobile war council. She would listen to the reports, study the maps, and offer her sharp, strategic advice. She had a particular gift for logistics, for the unglamorous but vital work of ensuring this massive army had the food, water, and ammunition it needed to keep moving and keep fighting. Her administrative skill was as potent a weapon as any rifle. Few hundred Italian survivors from Amba Alagi, along with other scattered garrisons, fell back and consolidated at the strongest Italian position in the region, the newly constructed fort at Mekelle, commanded by General Giuseppe Aramondi. They dug in, expecting the full weight of the Ethiopian army to descend upon them. The first act of the war was over. The Italians had been bloodied and thrown on the defensive. But the main event, the confrontation between the two great armies and their leaders, was yet to come. The stage was now set for a siege. A battle of wills that would give Empress Taytu her first great opportunity to demonstrate her own unique and brilliant brand of military strategy. The stage was now set for a siege. A battle of wills that would give Empress Taytu her first great opportunity to demonstrate her own unique and brilliant brand of military strategy, and so the great Ethiopian army, a tide of humanity over 100,000 strong, flowed north with the emperor and empress at its head. In early January 1896, they arrived at Mekelle and surrounded the Italian fort. You can see it in your mind's eye, a formidable stone fortress, Inda Yasses, built on a commanding hill, its walls bristling with cannons and machine guns. Inside were about 1,500 troops, mostly Eritrean askaris, under the command of Italian officers, led by a tough and determined commander, General Giuseppe Aramondi. They were well stocked with ammunition and rations. They believed they could hold out for months, bleeding the Ethiopian army in costly assaults until a relief force could arrive from the main Italian army further north. A direct, frontal attack would be a massacre. In the Ethiopian War Council, the generals debated. The more aggressive commanders, proud warriors eager for glory, argued for an immediate, full-scale assault. They had the numbers, they argued. They could overwhelm the fort through sheer force. Others, more cautious, argued for a long siege to starve the garrison out. But this also had its problems. A long siege would be a massive drain on the Ethiopian army's own supplies and would give General Baratieri and the main Italian army plenty of time to maneuver and come to the fort's rescue. It was a difficult strategic problem, and it was here that Empress Taytu, observing the situation with her keen chess player's eye, saw the flaw in the Italian position. It was a flaw born of arrogance, an assumption that their enemies would only think in terms of brute force. The fort was strong, the ammunition was plentiful, the food was adequate. But Taytu, likely through her own intelligence network and careful observation, noted that the fort's only reliable source of water came from a well and a nearby river located outside the main walls. The Italians had built a state-of-the-art fortress, a testament to European military engineering. They had just forgotten to put the water source inside it. It was a classic case of architectural oops, and it was about to cost them dearly. You can imagine her in the war council, a lone woman among the great bearded generals and noblemen. While they discussed troop formations and artillery bombardments, she offered a solution of devastating simplicity. Why waste the lives of our soldiers trying to break down stone walls? She argued. A man can live for weeks without food, but he can only survive a few days without water. We do not need to take the fort. We only need to take the well. Historians debate the extent to which the water strategy was solely Taytu's idea. Controlling an enemy's water source is, of course, a classic military tactic known since antiquity. It is likely that other experienced commanders also saw the fort's vulnerability. But tradition and many historical accounts give Taytu the primary credit for forcefully and persuasively championing this strategy in the council, for cutting through the military posturing and focusing on the enemy's most critical weakness. She convinced Menelik and the other generals that a battle of thirst was far wiser than a battle of blood. The plan was approved. Instead of a massive, costly assault on the fort itself, the Ethiopians launched a series of precise, targeted attacks with one goal: to seize control of the water supply. Under the command of leaders, including Taytu's own brother, Ras Well Betul, the Ethiopian soldiers stormed the outlying positions and, after a sharp fight, captured the well and secured the banks of the river. The tap was turned off, inside the fort. The mood quickly shifted from defiance to desperation. The 2 weeks that followed were an agony of thirst. Water was rationed by the thimbleful. The mules and horses, essential for transport, died first. The soldiers, suffering from dehydration under the hot African sun, grew weak and demoralized. Their modern rifles were useless against an enemy they couldn't see. An enemy that simply sat outside their walls, waiting. The Italian command had planned for a battle of guns and cannons. Taytu had given them a battle of physiology, and it was a battle they could not win. After 15 days, with his men on the verge of collapse, General Aramondi had no choice but to raise the white flag and ask for terms of surrender. And here, Menelik, likely with Taytu's counsel, showed his political cunning. Instead of slaughtering or imprisoning the garrison, he offered them remarkably lenient terms. The Italian officers and their Eritrean troops were allowed to march out of the fort with their rifles, and were given a military escort to ensure their safe passage back to the main Italian army. This decision was a masterstroke of public relations. It demonstrated to the world that Ethiopia was a civilized nation that adhered to the European rules of war. Even when dealing with an invading army, it avoided creating Italian martyrs, which would have inflamed public opinion back in Italy and led to calls for a harsher war of vengeance. And on a purely strategic level, it burdened General Baratieri's main army with another 1,500 mouths to feed. It was like winning the championship game and then generously helping the losing team carry their gear back to the bus. It showed confidence, magnanimity, and made the Italians look even more like the aggressors on the world stage. The commander, General Aramondi, was reportedly so humbled by the strategy and the merciful treatment that he later sent a personal letter of thanks to one of the Ethiopian generals. The siege of Mekelle was a triumph. It was a victory won not with brute force, but with superior intelligence. And it cemented Empress Taytu's reputation in the army and across the nation as not just a royal consort, but a brilliant military strategist in her own right. The fall of the fort was another blow to Italian prestige, but it also concentrated their forces. The surrendered garrison marched north and rejoined Baratieri's main army. Now, all the players were on the board. The preliminary skirmishes were over. The final, decisive confrontation was approaching. The road to Adwa was now open. The road to Adwa was now open, and that road was not a short or easy one. It was a path of dust, rock, and hunger, a month long. High-stakes chess match played across the unforgiving terrain of the Tigran highlands. After the victory at Mekelle, the great Ethiopian army continued its slow, deliberate march north, a human river flowing towards the main Italian force which had dug in near the town of Adagrat. You have to imagine the sheer scale of this movement. This was a mobile city of over 100,000 people, including not just warriors, but also thousands of camp followers, wives, priests, and servants, all moving with a shared purpose. The glint of the sun on tens of thousands of rifle barrels and spear points would have been a terrifying and magnificent sight. Moving and feeding such a force was a logistical miracle in itself, a testament to the administrative skill of the imperial court, with Taytu's oversight being crucial. They relied on the pre-placed supply depots they had established months earlier and on the land itself. But even with careful planning, feeding this many people was a monumental challenge. Every day of the campaign was a race against dwindling supplies. Meanwhile, the Italian commander, General Barutieri, was in an even worse predicament. His army, now consolidated, numbered around 17,000 men. On paper, they were a formidable modern force with superior artillery and machine guns. But they were deep in hostile territory, at the very end of a long, fragile supply line that snaked back to the coast. The Italian army was at the end of a logistical tether that was longer and more unreliable than a dial-up internet connection in the 1990s. The soldiers were on half rations. Their uniforms were ragged, and much of the hardtack biscuit they were issued was found to be rotten and infested with insects. Morale was plummeting. Baratieri knew he could not win a direct, pitched battle against Menelik's enormous host. So he adopted a strategy of patience. He would hold his fortified position and wait. He believed, as many Europeans did, that such a large, primitive army couldn't possibly hold together for long. He gambled that starvation and internal squabbles would cause the Ethiopian force to simply dissolve, melting back into the hills without him having to fire a shot. He wanted to win a war of logistics, and so, for the entire month of February 1896, the two armies shadowed each other in the hills and valleys around the town of Adwa. It was the world's most stressful camping trip. Two giant forces sat watching each other, maneuvering for position, each hoping the other would run out of food and patience first. The Ethiopians shifted their main camp several times, trying to find better grazing for their animals and to lure the Italians out of their fortified positions. A key debate among military historians revolves around Menelik's decision to hold his army in this region for so long. Was it a brilliant strategic pause designed to draw the Italians into a trap on ground the Ethiopians knew intimately? Or was Menelik facing his own severe supply crisis and on the verge of ordering a retreat himself just before the Italians made their fateful move? The pressure was immense on both sides. Inside the Ethiopian War Council, Empress Taytu was a powerful voice for action. She was deeply suspicious of Baratiri's waiting game. Along with the more aggressive generals, she argued that they should force a confrontation. She feared that a long, inactive stalemate would sap the army's morale, and that their own supplies would give out before the Italians. She reportedly grew impatient with any commander who seemed hesitant, at times using her sharp tongue to question their courage and stiffen their resolve. Her method of motivation was apparently very effective. Her stance was clear. We have come this far. We have the advantage of numbers and spirit. We must not let this opportunity slip away. The pressure on General Baratiri was even more intense. He was receiving a constant stream of angry telegrams from the Prime Minister in Rome, Francesco Crispi. Crispi was a politician who desperately needed a glorious military victory to distract from problems at home. He accused Baratiri of cowardice and incompetence for his failure to act. In one infamous telegram, he railed against the general for running a military sickness rather than a war. The political pressure from thousands of miles away was becoming unbearable. Finally, at the end of February, Baratiri's hand was forced. His own supplies were critical. His scouts wrongly reported that the Ethiopian army, weakened by starvation, was beginning to disperse, and the taunts from Rome had become too much to bear. Against his own better military judgment, he decided he had to risk everything on one bold, desperate gamble. On the evening of February 29, 1896, leap year, he gave the order. Under the cover of darkness, the Italian army would advance in 3 columns, marching through the night to occupy what he believed were commanding heights from which he could launch a surprise attack on the Ethiopian camp at dawn. You can feel the tension of that moment. A weary, half-starved army is roused in the middle of the night. They are given their orders to march through a landscape of treacherous ravines and confusing mountain passes that are completely unknown to them, but which are as familiar as their own homes to their enemy. The maps they are using are poor and inaccurate. The guides are unreliable. The 3 columns are ordered to march separately, losing visual contact with each other in the pitch blackness. It is a plan riddled with risk, a desperate throw of the dice by a general pushed beyond his limits. The road to Adwa was about to reach its bloody and decisive end. The sun was about to rise on a battle that would change the course of history. The sun was about to rise on a battle that would change the course of history. And as the first pale light of dawn on March 1st, 1896, began to silhouette the jagged peaks around the holy town of Adwa, it revealed a scene of utter chaos. General Baratiri's grand, desperate plan for a surprise attack had already fallen apart in the darkness. His 3 columns of soldiers, marching through the night in a landscape they did not know, were hopelessly lost. The Italian plan for a stealthy night march was a masterpiece of unintentional comedy. It was like trying to sneak into a quiet library by driving a fleet of loud, clattering trucks through the front door. They had made so much noise stumbling through the ravines and rocky passes that Ethiopian scouts had been tracking their movements for hours. The element of surprise was completely gone. Worse still, the columns were separated. The maps the Italian commanders were using were disastrously inaccurate. The local guides they had forced into service were either incompetent or, more likely, deliberately unhelpful. The central column was delayed. The right column, under General de Bermuda, had veered off on a wild tangent into the wrong valley, and the left column, composed of Eritrean Ascoris under General Albertone, had, with monumental misfortune, marched several miles past its intended objective and was now blundering directly towards the main encampment of the Ethiopian army. It was perhaps the worst "are we there yet" moment in modern military history. Instead of a coordinated line of battle on high ground, Barretir's army was a scattered, disorganized, exhausted mess. In the Ethiopian camp, the news spread like lightning. It was a Sunday, and for the deeply pious Ethiopians, it was also the feast day of St. George, one of their most revered saints, the Dragon Slayer. Many of the soldiers were attending early morning mass when the scouts galloped in with the astonishing report. The Italians were advancing, and they were marching in separated columns right into the jaws of the trap. There is a debate among historians as to whether Menelik knew the full, disastrous extent of the Italian deployment from the very beginning, or if he simply knew they were advancing and trusted his commanders to exploit the situation. Whatever he knew, he acted with lightning speed. The initial disbelief gave way to a steely resolve. The gift of battle, which he had patiently waited for, was now being delivered to him on his own terms. He gave the order to attack. Taytu was at his side, offering prayers to St. George for victory, but also, no doubt, adding her own firm voice to the decision. The great war drums began to beat out a thunderous rhythm across the valley. Horns made from elephant tusks blew, and from the sprawling camp, the great army of Ethiopia, a force the Italians had believed to be starving and on the verge of collapse, surged forward with a terrifying roar. They were about to show the Italians what it meant to fight a nation, defending its home. The soldiers, their morale soaring at the belief that St. George himself was riding with them, charged forward to meet the invaders. The first to feel their wrath was General Albertone's lost column of Ascaris. They had just reached what they thought was their objective when they looked up and saw, pouring over the hills in front of them, an overwhelming tide of Ethiopian warriors. The lead elements of the Ethiopian army, tens of thousands of men under the command of generals like Ras Makanan and Ras Mikhail, slammed into Albertone's single, isolated brigade. The Eritrean Ascaris were brave and well-trained soldiers. They formed their lines and unleashed disciplined volleys of rifle fire into the charging Ethiopians, inflicting terrible casualties. But for every man that fell, 10 more seemed to take his place. The sheer weight of numbers was crushing. The Ethiopians, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain, swarmed around the flanks of the beleaguered column. The Italian artillery tried to offer support, but it was inaccurate and quickly overwhelmed. For 2 hours, Albertone's men held on in a desperate, heroic, but ultimately hopeless fight. They were an island being swallowed by a raging sea. General Albertone himself, seeing his command being cut to pieces, was captured. His brigade, which had begun the day as a proud, disciplined unit, ceased to exist. It was completely shattered, its survivors either killed, captured, or fleeing for their lives across the unforgiving landscape. The Ethiopians, having annihilated the first Italian column, did not stop to celebrate. They reformed their lines and, with their blood up, turned their attention to the other 2 Italian columns, which were still miles away, confused by the roar of battle and unsure of what was happening. General Bariteri, from his command post, could only listen in horror as the sounds of Albertone's desperate fight faded into an ominous silence. He had lost 1/3 of his army before the main battle had even properly begun. The sun was now fully up. The initial phase of the Battle of Adwa was over. It had been a catastrophic failure for the Italians and a stunning success for the Ethiopians. But there were still 2 more Italian columns on the field, and thousands more soldiers to fight. The bloodiest work of the day was still to come. And in the center of it all, directing her own forces and watching the tide of battle with the strategists, I was the Empress. The bloodiest work of the day was still to come. And in the center of it all, directing her own forces and watching the tide of battle with the strategists, I was the Empress. The Empress was not a distant observer, safely tucked away in the rear. She was an active commander on the field, a testament to the long tradition of formidable warrior women in Ethiopian history. You can see her on a hill near Menelik's own command post, a position that gave them a panoramic, godlike view of the unfolding chaos below. She is surrounded by her personal guard, and with her is her own army of force of some 3,000 infantry and 600 cavalry, loyal to her personally. And crucially, she commands her own artillery battery, a unit of modern cannons she had procured herself. This was not a ceremonial role. She was a general with troops and guns at her disposal. After the destruction of Albertone's column, the full weight of the Ethiopian army crashed like a wave against the Italian center. Commanded by General Aramondi, the same general who had been forced to surrender at Mekelle. This was the heart of the Italian force, composed of their best Italian troops. They formed a defensive line on and around a hill known as Mount Bila, and for hours the fighting was ferocious. The Italian artillery and machine guns tore bloody holes in the Ethiopian ranks, but still they came, wave after wave of warriors charging with a courage born of religious fervor and a fierce love for their land. Menelik committed his elite imperial guard, the Mahal Seferi, to the fight, and the battle for the high ground became a brutal, grinding affair. From her command post, Taytu watched the ebb and flow of the battle. The precise nature of her tactical commands during the battle is a subject of some debate. Was she personally aiming the cannons and ordering individual units forward like a modern field officer? Or was her role more broadly strategic, directing her commanders to shore up a weak point in the Ethiopian line, or to exploit a momentary Italian hesitation? The latter is more likely, but what is certain is that she was an active participant. Her artillery, under her direction, added its fire to the bombardment of the Italian positions on Mount Bila. For the average Ethiopian soldier, the sight of their empress on the battlefield, calmly directing cannon fire against the invaders, must have been an awe-inspiring and electrifying spectacle. It was like discovering your very dignified, deeply pious grandmother is also an expert tactician who knows her way around heavy artillery. Meanwhile, the third major Italian column under General de Bermuda was in a world of its own. De Bermuda's brigade was so hopelessly lost that for the first few hours of the battle, they were marching away from the fighting on an involuntary scenic tour of a valley several miles away. When the sound of Aramondi's desperate battle finally reached him, he turned his column around and tried to march to the sound of the guns. But it was too late. It was isolated, and Ethiopian forces, specifically the army of Ras Mikhael, were already moving to intercept him. He was marching into a fresh ambush. Back at the center, the pressure on Aramondi's line was becoming unbearable. The Ethiopians' sheer numbers began to tell. They swarmed the Italian flanks. Menelik and Taytu, seeing the Italian line begin to waver, would have recognized the decisive moment. You can imagine her turning to Menelik and urging him to commit the final reserves, to break the enemy completely, rather than allowing them to conduct an orderly retreat. She knew that you don't just win a battle. You have to win it so decisively that your enemy doesn't get any ideas about a rematch next season around midday. Aramondi's line finally shattered. The Italian soldiers, exhausted, thirsty, and overwhelmed, broke and fled. The battle for the center had been won. The Ethiopians then turned their full attention to the Bermuda's lost and isolated column. Surrounded in what became known as the Valley of Mariam Shavitu, his brigade made a brave final stand, but was systematically cut to pieces. De Bermuda, too, was killed. By late afternoon, the battle was over. What had been a proud, modern European army that morning was now a terrified, fleeing mob. The Ethiopian victory was not just a victory. It was a rout. The discipline of the Italian army had completely disintegrated. They abandoned their rifles, their cannons, their supplies, everything in a desperate scramble to get back to the border of Eritrea. The great battle had become a great chase. Throughout the day, Taytu's presence had been a powerful force. The Ethiopian army included a small but significant contingent of female warriors, often tasked with defending the camp or carrying water. But Taytu's command role was the ultimate expression of this tradition. She was the embodiment of the national will to resist. Her calmness under fire, her strategic input, and the sight of her own troops entering the fray were crucial elements of the victory. While Menelik was the ultimate authority, Taytu was the unyielding spirit of the nation, the fierce advocate for total victory, the chessmaster who had seen the whole board and knew exactly when to declare checkmate. Now, as the sun began to set over the blood-soaked hills of Adwa, that checkmate was complete. The Italian army was broken, and the independence of Ethiopia was secure. Now, as the sun began to set over the blood-soaked hills of Adwa, that checkmate was complete. The Italian army was broken, and the independence of Ethiopia was secure. The sun sets on a scene of carnage and triumph. The Valley of Adwa, which had woken to the sound of Sunday prayers, is now a vast, silent testament to a world turned upside down. In the fading light, you can see the true scale of the Ethiopian victory and the totality of the Italian disaster. Of the roughly 17,000 soldiers General Barutiri had led into battle that morning, some 6,000 were killed or wounded, and another 3,000 were taken prisoner. All of their artillery, tens of thousands of rifles, and all of their supplies were captured. It was a loss of staggering proportions, an unprecedented catastrophe for a modern European army in the age of colonialism. The aftermath on the field was grim, and it revealed the complex nature of the war. The Italian prisoners were rounded up. They were hungry, terrified, and utterly defeated. Under the orders of Menelik and Taytu, they were treated with a surprising degree of humanity. They were fed from the Ethiopians' own dwindling supplies and held as valuable bargaining chips for the peace negotiations that were sure to follow. But the captured Eritrean askrias, the colonial troops who had fought for the Italians, received a very different fate. In the eyes of the Ethiopians, they were not honorable opponents. They were traitors, fellow Africans who had willingly served a foreign invader. The punishment for many of them was brutal, carried out according to the traditional laws of war. For treason, many had a right hand and a left foot amputated, a horrifying sentence designed to prevent them from ever marching or firing a rifle again. It is a grim and uncomfortable detail, one that complicates any simple, heroic narrative. There is a significant and sensitive historical debate surrounding this act, with some historians framing it as an understandable, if harsh, reaction to treason in a war for national survival, while others critique it as an extreme cruelty that underscores the ethnic complexities of the region. But while the fate of the prisoners was being decided on the battlefield, the news of the battle itself was beginning to travel across the world, carried by telegraph wires. When the news reached Italy, it was met first with stunned disbelief, then with a tidal wave of national humiliation and rage. Riots erupted in Rome, Milan, and other major cities. The public, who had been promised a swift and glorious colonial conquest, turned on the government that had led them to disaster. Prime Minister Francesco Crispi, the man who had pushed so relentlessly for the war, saw his government collapse within days. It was the political equivalent of finding out your champion national team, favored to win the World Cup, had just been defeated 10-0 by a previously unknown amateur club. There was shock, there was fury, and a lot of powerful men suddenly found themselves unemployed across the rest of Europe. Colonial administrators in London, Paris, and Berlin practically choked on their tea. The Battle of Adwa was a direct assault on the core ideology of imperialism. The myth of European racial superiority and military invincibility. The prevailing wisdom was that a small, disciplined European force equipped with modern technology would always defeat a much larger non-European army. Adwa proved in a most spectacular and bloody fashion that this was dangerously untrue. The story was front-page news across the world. For the first time, a European power had been decisively, catastrophically defeated by an African army. In a major, set-piece battle, the house of cards that was the scramble for Africa suddenly looked very fragile indeed. And if the news was a shock in Europe, it was a thunderclap of inspiration across Africa and the African diaspora. Adwa became a legend, a powerful symbol of hope and resistance. It was proof that the European conqueror was not invincible. It demonstrated that a unified African nation could defend its freedom. The victory at Adwa would inspire early nationalist movements across the continent for decades to come. In the Americas, it became a rallying cry for Pan-Africanists and civil rights leaders. Adwa became the ultimate historical receipt. For generations, whenever a colonial power boasted of its inherent superiority or its so-called civilizing mission, people of African descent could point to that day in the mountains of Tigray and say, "Tell that to Menelik and Taytu." To commemorate their divine and military victory, Menelik and Taytu later commissioned a brand new church in Addis Ababa, the Cathedral of St. George, dedicated to the saint on whose day their triumph was won. Inside, they had a massive painting of the battle installed, a permanent public monument to their victory, with the emperor and empress themselves depicted as the triumphant, God-favored leaders of their people. The world had been turned on its head. An African nation had not just resisted colonialism, it had crushed it. Now, the victors Menelik, the pragmatic emperor, and Taytu, the unyielding empress, held all the cards. It would not be they who would sue for peace. It would be a humbled and desperate Italy that would send its envoys to their court, this time not to offer a treacherous treaty, but to beg for the return of their captured soldiers and to negotiate a peace on Ethiopia's terms. It would be a humbled and desperate Italy that would send its envoys to their court, but to beg for the return of their captured soldiers and to negotiate a peace on Ethiopia's terms. And so they came, not with the swagger of conquerors, but with the downcast eyes of the defeated. Their fine diplomatic coats dusted with the shame of Adwa, the negotiating table in Addis Ababa was a world away from the one at Wuchali. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. The Italian envoys found themselves facing an emperor and an empress who held all the cards, thousands of Italian prisoners, a victorious and confident army, and the moral high ground on the world. Stage. The negotiations for a new treaty began, and Empress Taytu was a dominant, unyielding presence. While Menelik may have been willing to be more conciliatory to hasten the peace, Taytu was the guardian of the victory. She had seen firsthand how a single, ambiguous word could be twisted into a weapon. She was determined that the new treaty would be airtight, a document of such clarity that not even the most creative lawyer in Rome could find a loophole in it. The Italian envoys came to the table with a new attitude. This time, they probably brought their own translators, a second team of translators to check the first team's work, and a magnifying glass to read every single word. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool an empress who commands her own artillery, and you will not get a third chance. The result. Signed in October of 1896 was the Treaty of Addis Ababa. Its terms were a mirror image of the humiliation Italy had tried to inflict on Ethiopia. Article: I declared the unconditional and total annulment of the Treaty of Wuchali. It was not to be amended. Article 2 contained the ultimate prize. Italy recognized the absolute and unequivocal independence of the Empire of Ethiopia. There was no talk of protectorates, no mention of spheres of influence. It was a clear and total admission of Ethiopian sovereignty. Only after these articles were agreed upon did the treaty address the release of the thousands of Italian prisoners, whose freedom was conditional on Italy paying a large indemnity to cover the cost of their upkeep. With the peace secured and Ethiopia's independence guaranteed, the nation entered a period of relative stability and modernization, and Taytu's influence reached its zenith. She was no longer just the empress consort. She was a national hero, the architect of the great victory. She turned her formidable energy to domestic affairs. She championed the construction of the first proper roads in her new capital. She supported the arts and the church, and, in a move that showed her pragmatic side, she oversaw the construction of the Ethiopia Taytu Hotel in 1907. Ethiopia was her title as empress. She knew that foreign dignitaries and businessmen would continue to come to Ethiopia, so she decided it was best they had a comfortable, modern place to stay where, of course, their activities could be discreetly monitored. National development, one part national security. The hotel still stands and operates today, a living piece of her legacy. But the years of triumph were followed by years of political struggle. Around 1906, Emperor Menelik's health began to fail. He suffered a series of strokes that left him increasingly paralyzed and unable to govern. As his light faded, Taytu's power grew to fill the void. She became the de facto ruler of the empire, a regent in all but name. She vetted all official documents. She made and unmade political appointments. She dismissed ministers she distrusted, and she fiercely protected the authority of her incapacitated husband against any who would try to usurp it. For a few years, she was the most powerful person in Ethiopia, an empress ruling in her own right. But her uncompromising nature, which had been such a strength during the war, made her powerful enemies in peacetime. Historians debate the reasons for Taytu's eventual fall from power. Was it primarily due to a misogynistic backlash from powerful male nobles who could not accept a woman as their ultimate ruler? Or was it a more calculated political move by a rival faction, the Shuhan nobility, who resented the influence of Taytu's northern family and feared she would place one of her own kinsmen on the throne after Menelik's death? Her staunchly anti-foreign stance also alienated those who believed Ethiopia needed to engage more, not less, with the outside world to truly modernize. Whatever the primary cause, a powerful coalition of her opponents formed against her. In 1910, they confronted the bedridden emperor and, using his authority, forced the issue. Taytu, seeing that the political tide had turned against her and wanting to avoid a civil war, agreed to relinquish her power. She was forced into retirement, her political life effectively over. Her enemies had finally succeeded where the Italians had failed. Taytu had spent years outmaneuvering her nation's enemies, only to learn the hard lesson that the most dangerous opponents are often not the foreign armies at the gate, but the supposed allies in your own court. She spent her final years in seclusion at the Entoto Mariam Church, high on the mountain overlooking the city she had founded. Her last great role was not as an empress or a general, but as a devoted wife, caring for the ailing Menelik until his death in 1913. She would outlive him by 5 years. A quiet, dignified end for a woman who had lived such a loud and consequential life. She was a queen who had checkmated an empire only to be slowly sidelined in the final complex endgame of her own nation's politics. She was a queen who had checkmated an empire only to be slowly sidelined in the final complex endgame of her own nation's politics. But the endgame of court politics, with its messy compromises and shifting loyalties, can never erase the pure, shining clarity of a great historical moment. Taytu's fall from power was a personal tragedy, but her legacy was already forged in the fire of Adwa and the defiance of her diplomacy. Her story had become larger than her own life in the years and decades after her death in 1918. Her legacy only grew. For Ethiopians, she became a revered mother of the nation, the embodiment of their fierce independence. For the rest of Africa, groaning under the weight of colonial rule, she and Menelik became semi-mythical figures, icons of successful resistance. And for women across the world, the story of an empress who commanded armies and outwitted foreign envoys became an inspiration, a powerful example of female leadership in a world overwhelmingly dominated by men. Modern scholars, particularly feminist historians, continue to debate whether Taytu should be viewed through the lens of modern feminism. Some argue that applying this label is anachronistic, as her power was used to defend a traditional, patriarchal, and aristocratic system. Others forcefully argue that her very existence as a center of power, her defiance of prescribed gender, roles in politics and warfare, and her profound influence on the course of history make her an essential feminist icon. Regardless of the specific context of her time, the power of her legacy was put to the test in 1935, when a new Italy, under the fascist rule of Benito Mussolini, sought to avenge the humiliation of Adwa. This time, they came with tanks, bombers, and poison gas. They occupied Ethiopia for 5 brutal years. But even in that dark time, the memory of 1896 was a burning light. The Ethiopian resistance fighters, the Arpignak, were fueled by the stories of the great victory. The names of Menelik and Taytu were on their lips as they fought, a reminder that an Italian army had been beaten before and could be beaten again. Taytu's legacy was not just a story. It was a weapon. Even her name seemed destined for her role. In her native language, the name Taytu is often interpreted to mean sunshine or the sun. Her given title, Betul, can mean light. So her name, Taytu Betul, poetically translates to the Son of Light, a fitting name for the woman who would become known as the Light of Ethiopia. She was laid to rest next to her husband, Menelik, in the Taikat Negus Bata La Mariam Monastery in Addis Ababa, the two architects of a modern, independent Ethiopia, united in death as they had been in life. But now, these debates and details are for the bright light of day. For tonight, in the quiet of your room, we can let the arguments fade away. Let the sharp-edged facts of history soften into the gentle contours of a dream. Let the light of her name, Taytu, the sun, begin to set slowly in your mind. The story is over now. There is nothing more to learn, nothing more to analyze. You can release the names and the dates, the treaties and the battles, and let them all drift away like clouds dissipating after a great storm. The sounds of the battlefield fade into a profound silence, replaced only by the soft whisper of the wind sweeping across the high plateaus. The vivid image of the Empress at court, her eyes flashing with intelligence and defiance, softens and dissolves into a memory, a feeling of strength and peace. Let your mind drift back to where our journey began, to that quiet, cool mountaintop in the Ethiopian highlands. The sun has now set, and the sky above you is a vast, deep indigo, filled with a brilliant spray of stars that seem close enough to touch. The air is still and cool on your skin. The rugged mountains that were once the stage for a great historical drama are now just silent, sleeping shapes in the deep twilight. All the striving, all the conflict, all the courage has settled into a deep and profound tranquility. There is only the quiet of the mountain, the vastness of the sky, and the gentle, steady rhythm of your own breathing. A quiet and ancient current now carrying you away from this story and into the deep and restful peace of your own sweet dreams.